When I first bought the old lake property, I didn't think much about the fact that it bordered a new subdivision. My cabin had been sitting there long before the HOA even existed, tucked at the far end of the lake where the tree line met the water, surrounded by a stretch of land I had quietly purchased years ago from an old rancher who wanted to retire, giving me not just the cabin but the entire shoreline on that side of the lake, along a along a of the subdivision residents thought were community greenbelts. To me, it was simply a perfect retreat. Quiet mornings fishing, evenings watching the sun burn gold across the water, and the kind of privacy city people only dreamed of. That peace lasted about 2 weeks until Karen showed up. Karen was the self-proclaimed queen of the new subdivision's HOA, a woman whose sharp bob haircut, neon workout suits, and clipboard seemed glued to her hand as she strutted from house to house enforcing rules no one actually remembered voting for. My first encounter with her was on a Sunday morning when I was fixing the dock planks. She marched right up to me, introduced herself not as Karen, but as President Richardson of the Lakeshore HOA, and handed me a packet stuffed with rules, regulations, and due statements, claiming that since I lived on the lake, I was automatically required to join. I laughed, politely at first, pointing out that my property wasn't part of the subdivision. My deed showed no encumbrances, and the county records were clear. I owned my land outright, independent of their little association. Karen's smile twitched, her eyes narrowed, and she insisted I was confused that the HOA had jurisdiction over all lakefront residents, which was funny since my cabin had been standing decades before their first model home was even built. I sent her packing with a firm, "No thanks," but that only seemed to fuel her fire. Within days, I started getting threatening letters taped to my cabin door. $250 fines for unauthorized dock usage, $500 fines for unapproved exterior paint, and even a warning that my fishing boat wasn't in compliance with lake community boating standards. I ignored them all, each one more absurd than the last, but Karen escalated faster than I could have imagined. One afternoon, as I was coming back from town with supplies, I found two police cruisers parked at the end of my driveway. The officers looked uncomfortable as Karen stood there in her HOA polo shirt, arms crossed, barking about how I was refusing to comply with community regulations and endangering the harmony of the neighborhood. I showed the officers my deed, county maps, even tax records that proved my property was separate, and though they apologized, they admitted they had to respond to the call since Karen had insisted I was a trespasser. That word lit a fuse in me. Trespasser? On land I owned outright, land I had paid taxes on for years, land I leased portions of to the very developer who built her subdivision? Because that was the twist Karen didn't know yet. Those pretty houses across the water, the streets winding through her subdivision, even the fancy HOA clubhouse she loved to hold her meetings in, all sat on ground where I still held title as the underlying landowner, leased to the development company for 99 years. It meant I wasn't just a neighbor she could bully into submission. I was her landlord, the silent owner in the background, who had the ultimate power to raise fees, restrict access, or pull the rug out from under their entire neighborhood if they pushed me too far. But Karen wasn't the type to listen, wasn't the type to research before attacking. She just doubled down, convinced her fake authority would overwhelm me. She didn't know that while she was busy weaponizing fine notices and wasting the police department's time, I was quietly gathering every record, every lease, every clause that tied her entire HOA kingdom to me like a leash, waiting for the right moment to yank it hard enough to remind her exactly who she was dealing with. And so, as she stormed off that day, vowing to bring the full weight of the HOA down on me, I stood there on my own land, already knowing the ending of this story. Karen thought she was fighting a stubborn neighbor, but what she was really doing was picking a fight with her landlord. And sooner rather than later, that truth was going to crush her world like a hammer through glass. The fallout from Karen's first attempt to weaponize the police against me was almost comical, but it didn't take long for her to double down. The very next morning, I awoke to the sound of hammering and voices near the end of my driveway, and when I walked down to investigate, I found Karen and two HOA board members planting a cheap aluminum sign that read "Private HOA Property, Residents Only, No Unauthorized Entry," right on my own. When I asked what in the world they thought they were doing, Karen straightened her posture and smugly explained that since I refused to join, they had no choice but to restrict me until I complied. And she even handed me another fine notice for trespassing just to emphasize her point. I couldn't help but laugh. But underneath that laugh was cold fury, The arrogance in assuming that some piece of corrugated metal from Home Depot bolted into my soil could magically strip me of ownership was so delusional it was almost sad, but it also confirmed something I'd suspected since the first encounter. Karen wasn't just a petty busybody with too much time. She was obsessed with control, addicted to it like a drug, and addicted to it like a drug. Beyond the subdivision borders, as though the rules she typed up in her kitchen were law itself. I pulled out my phone, took a dozen pictures, and told her flatly to remove the sign, or I'd treat it as unlawful encroachment. Her smirk widened, and she dared me to call the cops the way she had, confident that her constant nagging would eventually wear me down. But what she didn't know was that I had already set things in motion behind the scenes. I had called my attorney, requested updated certified copies of all the master lease agreements for the subdivision, and asked him to highlight every clause where the HOA had obligations tied directly to me as the landowner. Maintenance requirements, easements, access rights, and most importantly, the lease clause that required rent adjustments every 10 years coming due within the next 6 months. Meaning, in plain English, I had the right to triple the ground rent their entire neighborhood paid me if I chose to, and if they didn't pay, they would default, lose their leasehold interest, and every house, every manicured lawn, every clubhouse would revert back into my possession. It was the nuclear option, and Karen had no idea she was practically begging me to press the button. Meanwhile, the harassment escalated. Within a week. I received no fewer than 10 bogus violation notices stuffed under my cabin door or taped to my truck, fines for improper lawn care, fines for illegal pets, my dog Ranger, who had lived with me for years, fines for using unapproved exterior materials because I had patched my dock with cedar instead of the HOA's approved pine, and even a threat of a lea, do so. My neighbors, the actual residents of the subdivision, started to notice too. Some whispered apologies when they saw me in town, embarrassed by Karen's antics, while others seemed emboldened by her and avoided eye contact, likely afraid of being fined themselves if they didn't fall in line. Karen, of course, saw every ounce of discomfort as validation, convinced she was winning. The breaking point came one Friday evening when I invited my sister and her family to the lake for a small cookout. As the kids were splashing in the shallow water near the dock, Karen marched down the hill with 2 board members, shouting that non-residents weren't allowed to use the lake without HOA approval and demanding my sister pack up and leave immediately. I told her flat out that the lakefront was my land, my dock, my family's right, but she pulled out her phone and started recording, screaming about illegal gatherings, violations, and unsafe activity. That's when my sister, who happened to work as a paralegal, calmly pointed out to Karen that she was trespassing on private land, and unless she wanted the sheriff to escort her off, she'd better turn around and leave. The look on Karen's face was priceless, caught between her craving for dominance and the realization that her bluff might actually blow back. But in the end, she stormed off with a dramatic threat. "You'll regret this. I'll make sure of it." I knew then that the war had officially begun, and while she was busy filing her petty complaints and harassing me with letters, I was preparing a counterstrike that would shake her HOA kingdom to its core. Over the next 2 weeks, I gathered every piece of ammunition I needed. County zoning maps proving the lakefront was mine, aerial surveys showing the HOA's greenbelt paths actually crossed my parcels, old agreements the developer signed, giving me the right to charge access fees for utilities and roads, and most importantly, the rent adjustment clause I mentioned before. By the time Karen organized her next HOA meeting, one she specifically invited me to with a smug little note saying attendance is mandatory for all residents, I was ready. I walked into that meeting hall, all eyes on me, with a leather folder tucked under my arm, and if Section 2 was the unveiling of the truth, Section 3 was the unraveling of Karen's empire. Because the meeting I had walked out of with the leases and documents laid bare had planted seeds of doubt in every resident's mind, seeds that sprouted into full-blown fear and anger in the days that followed. Yet instead of backing off or apologizing, Karen doubled down on her delusion, determined to prove that her HOA authority still carried more. Morning after that meeting, I awoke to an email blast from the HOA board with Karen's fingerprints all over it, declaring me a hostile outsider and claiming I was fabricating ownership in an effort to undermine the harmony of the community. She insisted that the HOA retained full rights to enforce compliance, and warned residents against engaging with me without board approval, even threatening fines for anyone who did. The email dripped with arrogance, as if by repeating her lies enough times, she could erase the reality of property law. But what she didn't realize was that several residents had already reached out to me privately, some cautiously, some almost desperately, asking for copies of the documents I had shown at the meeting because for years they had wondered why their deeds looked so unusual, why their mortgage paperwork mentioned leasehold title and mortgage paperwork mentioned leasehold title in. Puzzle was clicking into place. I forwarded them copies, and within a week, more than a dozen households had proof in their hands that Karen's HOA didn't own the land they stood on. I did. That revelation spread like wildfire through the community, and I started hearing whispers in town, at the hardware store, at the diner, even at the feed supply, people grumbling about rising HOA dues, about fines for trivial things like mailbox paint or lawn height, and now realizing all of that was being dictated by a woman whose entire power rested on sand. Karen, of course, panicked. She started holding emergency board meetings, cooking up new bylaws, and even hiring a lawyer to send me a threatening letter claiming that I was interfering with HOA governance. My attorney, who had seen this game 1,000 times before, laughed when he read it and drafted a reply so sharp it might as well have been a guillotine. Not only did I have every right to engage with the residents as their landlord, but the HOA itself was technically in breach of its lease for allowing dues collection and fines without proper disclosure of the land ownership structure. In other words, Karen wasn't just wrong, she was potentially guilty of fraud. I sat on that letter for a day, debating whether to send it immediately, but then something happened that pushed me over the edge. Karen, frustrated by her slipping grip, started staging harassment campaigns against me directly. One afternoon, I came back from town to find a tow notice slapped on my truck, claiming it was illegally parked on community property. The problem? The truck was sitting in my driveway. Another day, I caught a landscaper hired by the HOA trying to dig up part of my garden under Karen's orders, claiming it was common area. When I confronted him, he looked embarrassed, muttered an apology, and packed up, clearly realizing he was being used as a pawn in Karen's war. And then came the straw that broke the camel's back. Karen tried to block my mail. She actually went down to the post office, filed a complaint that my mailbox wasn't compliant with HOA standards, and asked them to stop delivery until I fixed it. The postmaster, who knew me personally, called me into his office laughing, showed me the complaint, and said, "Son, I've seen some stupid HOA stuff in my time, but this one takes the cake." That was it. I sent the letter. The HOA's attorney went radio silent after receiving it, which told me everything I needed to know. They had no ground to stand on, and Karen had overplayed her hand. But while the legal walls were closing in, I knew Karen wouldn't stop until she was utterly defeated, so I began laying my trap. The key was the rent adjustment clause, the one that allowed me to reassess the ground rent the HOA paid for use of the land their subdivision sat on. For decades, that rent had been absurdly low, a sweetheart deal struck by the original developer to attract buyers. But the clause said that every 10 years, the rent could be adjusted to prevailing market rates based on independent appraisal. The last adjustment had been 9 years and 10 months ago. I hired an appraiser, had him evaluate not just the land, but the infrastructure, roads, utilities, and access points, and when the report came back, it nearly made me laugh out loud. The market rent was more than triple what the HOA currently paid. That meant that within 2 months, I could legally raise their rent to a level that would bankrupt them if they didn't adapt. And if they defaulted, their leasehold interests would revert to me. I didn't want to evict families or cause chaos for innocent homeowners, but I wasn't going to let Karen terrorize me either, so I devised a plan. I would use the rent adjustment as leverage, offering the residents a choice, side with Karen and watch their HOA collapse under the weight of new rents, or side with me and restructure the entire arrangement in a way that freed them from Karen's tyranny while keeping their home secure. The more I thought about it, the more poetic it seemed. Karen's endless hunger for control would be the very thing that destroyed her HOA, because her war against me had triggered a chain of events that exposed their dependency on me, their landlord. And once the residents understood that, she'd have no throne left to sit on. Still, I had to bide my time carefully. Because Karen wasn't giving up without a fight, she started organizing what she called community patrols, groups of bored loyalists who walked the streets at night, looking for violations, which was nothing more than neighbors spying on neighbors, and I could feel the tension rising like a storm cloud over the lake. But I didn't flinch. I kept gathering evidence, documenting every stunt she pulled, and quietly meeting with residents who were fed up with her nonsense. The tide was turning, slowly but surely, and Karen, blinded by her obsession, couldn't see that her empire was crumbling beneath her feet. If Section 3 was the slow dismantling of Karen's fragile illusion of control, Section 4 was the full-blown unraveling. Because once word began to spread that the HOA lease was set to expire into a rent adjustment that could triple their costs, panic started seeping into the community like water through cracks in a dam. And instead of admitting defeat or even attempting to negotiate with me, Karen launched into her most unhinged camp and left, even if it meant dragging innocent people down with her. And I mean literally dragging. Because the very first thing she did was call the sheriff's department and claim that I was illegally occupying HOA property. A stunt so absurd it would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. When the deputies rolled up, they were already smirking, because this wasn't the first time they dealt with her nonsense. And when I showed them my deed folder, complete with certified leases, county tax receipts, and the upcoming rent adjustment clause, they practically rolled their eyes and told me not to worry. But the mere fact that she was willing to try law enforcement made it clear she was spiraling. Not long after, she escalated again. She filed a complaint with zoning enforcement claiming I was running a commercial operation on common land because I'd had contractors out for an appraisal, and when that didn't stick, she tried calling environmental services, insisting I was polluting the lake with my dock repairs. Each agency came, investigated, shook their heads, and walked away laughing. But every visit was another attempt to paint me as a problem, another thread in Karen's desperate tapestry of lies. And while all this was happening, she was rallying her loyalists in the HOA boardroom, screaming about how I was holding the community hostage and promising that she'd drive me out if it's the last thing I do. But what she didn't realize was that every time she pulled one of these stunts, more residents peeled away from her side, disillusioned by the insanity and quietly slipping into my camp. By the second week of this chaos, I had almost 30 households asking me how to get out from under the HOA entirely, and that was when I began unveiling my plan. Restructure the lease, dissolve the HOA, and replace their dues with a fair land rent directly to me, half of what Karen was charging them in dues and fines, but enough to meet the market adjustment requirements. It was a win-win. They'd pay less, I'd earn more, and Karen would lose everything. The catch, of course, was that I couldn't force it. They had to choose. So I began holding informal town hall meetings, sometimes in my backyard, sometimes at the firehouse down the road. And the more I explained, the more eyes lit up, because people who had been bled dry by Karen's petty fines and arbitrary rule changes could suddenly see freedom on the horizon. Naturally, Karen found out about these meetings, and that was when she launched her nuclear option. She tried to sue me. Yes, she actually filed a lawsuit in county court claiming that the HOA had exclusive authority over community property and that I was trespassing and defrauding homeowners. When my attorney handed me the filing, he couldn't stop laughing because it was so riddled with holes it might as well have been a sponge. First of all, she had no standing to sue me over land I owned. Second, her own lease agreements, which I had in black and white, clearly stated the homeowners were tenants of the land, not owners. Third, by filing such a baseless claim, she opened herself and the HOA board up to counterclaims for malicious prosecution and abuse of process. So we filed our response, attaching all the documents, and within 3 weeks, the judge dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning she couldn't refile it. That was the legal equivalent of a judge slamming the gavel and saying, "Sit down." But did Karen stop there? Of course not. She tried to spin the dismissal as a technical error and told residents the fight wasn't over, even as board members started resigning in droves, unwilling to be dragged into her madness. By this point, her credibility was collapsing so fast it was almost sad to watch. Almost. Then came her final stunt, the act of desperation that would seal her downfall. She tried to rally a protest at my property. One Saturday morning, about a dozen of her diehard loyalists showed up outside my gate with signs that said things like "Landlord tyranny," "In our lake, our rules," and they started chanting, trying to block my driveway. I walked out calmly, deed folder under my arm, and simply asked, who here actually wants to pay triple rent because Karen couldn't tell the truth? The silence that followed was deafening, and one by one, people dropped their signs and walked away, leaving Karen standing red-faced and shrieking by herself. I swear, if I hadn't been so focused on holding the line, I might have laughed until I cried. It was the moment everyone could see plainly. She wasn't a leader, she was a tyrant without a throne, a bully without teeth. And when her last supporters abandoned her, when the board resigned, when the court documents stamped her lawsuit into oblivion, the only thing left propping up her fantasy was her own ego. Meanwhile, the rent adjustment date crept closer and closer, and I prepared the final set of contracts that would give the residents a clear choice: freedom from Karen under fair terms, or continued chaos until the lease collapsed under its own weight. The residents could sense the shift, the inevitability of it, and by the time Section 4 closed, Karen's empire wasn't just crumbling, it was rubble, and she was clawing at the dust, refusing to admit the truth that everyone else already knew. Her reign was over. By the time the final section of this saga arrived, the truth had become undeniable. Karen's stranglehold on the community was broken, her influence scattered like ashes in the wind, and yet, in classic Karen fashion, she still refused to accept reality, clutching at whatever scraps of authority she thought she had left. But what she didn't know, what no one except me and my lawyer knew at that moment, was that the expiration of the legal detonation that would dissolve the entire HOA structure itself, because the homeowners association only existed as long as it had valid land rights to enforce its covenants, and when those rights reverted fully to me as the landlord, their bylaws, their fines, their threats, their rules about paint colors and mailbox sizes would vanish into thin air like smoke, unenforceable and irrelevant. And that meant every last dollar Karen had every last dollar Karen had every last dollar Karen had Hambia. Dues was about to come under scrutiny, because without legal standing, those dues could be challenged as fraudulent collections, opening the door for restitution claims, audits, and even criminal charges. So, when the date came, I made it official. I sent certified notices to every household stating that the HOA lease was terminated effective immediately, that the HOA was dissolved, and that future land occupancy would be under direct landlord contracts with me at fair market rates and with clear, transparent terms that forbade arbitrary fines and gave each family the freedom to enjoy their property without harassment. The reaction was electric. Neighbors who had lived under Karen's thumb for years were suddenly free. No more $100 penalties for leaving a kayak on the lawn, no more threats over planting the wrong type of shrub, no more humiliation at board meetings where Karen lorded over them like a queen. Instead, they had certainty, clarity, and relief. Many of them came to shake my hand personally, some even with tears in their eyes, thanking me for ending the nightmare. And it felt good, not just because I'd won, but because justice had finally been restored. Karen, of course, did not take it well. The day she got the notice, she stormed up my driveway in her usual flurry of rage, waving papers and screaming about how she would appeal this injustice and how she would take me all the way to federal court. But this time, there was no crowd behind her, no board to echo her, no neighbors nodding in fear. It was just her, red-faced, alone, shouting at the wind while I calmly told her that if she trespassed again, I'd call the sheriff. The same antics, and warned her multiple times. And that was the final humiliation. When she tried one last time to involve the police, insisting that I was some kind of slumlord and that the people needed her protection, the deputies who arrived looked her dead in the eye and told her flat out, "Ma'am, he owns this land, you don't. You need to leave before this turns into a charge for harassment." Watching her sputter, watching her realize that even law enforcement, the very tool she had always wielded like a club, was now fully against her, was the moment I knew she was finished. Within weeks, she resigned from the community entirely, selling her house in a fire sale and disappearing like a shadow at sunrise. And while she tried to stir up drama online, spinning tales of corruption and betrayal, no one cared, because the people who actually lived here were too busy enjoying their newfound freedom, fishing in the lake without harassment, swimming with their kids without fines, grilling on their patios without fear of citations. The HOA's old office was shuttered, its bank account frozen pending audit, and my lawyer was already helping several families file claims to recoup the thousands Karen had unlawfully fined them, which meant her retirement fund built on extortion would be bled dry in court, piece by piece, until she had nothing left. Meanwhile, I transformed the community into what it should have always been, a peaceful lakeside neighborhood where families could breathe easy, where land rent replaced extortion, where cooperation replaced coercion, and where my role wasn't that of some power-drunk tyrant but simply a fair landlord who made sure roads were maintained, lake access was preserved, and no one had to deal with a woman like Karen ever again. And as I sat one evening on my dock, watching the sunset paint the lake in gold and hearing the sound of children laughing across the water, I couldn't help but think about how close she'd come to ruining everything, how dangerous unchecked authority in the wrong hands could be, and how sweet it was to watch justice prevail. Karen thought she could call the cops, weaponize the law, and bully her way into control, but she forgot one thing. The land was mine, the law was on my side, and the community was tired of being ruled by fear. In the end, she lost everything, and I gained